Now, as great as Carol Channing's is, and Rita Moreno was when she was here, and all the other wonderful people that we've had come speak to us, the person I'm going to introduce to you now is right at the top, if not the top, of that list. And so I'm very thrilled and honored to introduce to you Captain Sullenberger, who, as you know, is the hero of the US Airways Flight 1549 that made that emergency landing in New York City on the Hudson River. But what you should know about him is that he has been in pursuit of safety for his entire adult life. While best known for serving as captain of that particular flight, the Miracle on the Hudson, Captain Sullenberger is an aviation safety expert and accident investigator. He serves as a CBS News aviation and safety expert and is the founder and CEO of Safety Reliability Methods, Inc., a company dedicated to management, safety performance, and reliable consulting. So after logging more than 20,000 hours of flight time, he became known internationally as Captain Sully as a result of that particular day on January 15th, 2009. The Airbus A320's two engines had lost thrust following a bird strike. Captain Sullenberger and his crew received international acclaim for their actions that day, including the passage of a congressional resolution recognizing their bravery. Captain Sullenberger was ranked second in the Time magazine Top 100 Most Influential Heroes and Icons of 2009. And he was awarded the French Legion of Honor. So, he is a hero, but beyond being a hero, he is committed to making sure we are safe. He has written 2 books. He's going to tell you about them, and then we have a surprise for you at the end. Please welcome, put your hands together and welcome Captain Sully Sullenberger.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. And Congresswoman, thank you so much for your wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of the 25th Seniors on the Move. So congratulations for that. And I want to thank the Congresswoman also for the support she has given all of us in important ways in helping to advance the cause that I care so much about in aviation safety, and also something I'm becoming more involved with, and that's applying what we've learned in aviation safety to other industries, including patient safety in medicine. Important work. So thank you for Congresswoman Speier. Well, it's great to be with you. You put me in kind of a tough spot here. I'm following our entertainer, Jim Stevens. And I'm not going to sing for you, although all those years in the church choir probably would help me a little bit. But I'm a native Texan also. Jim is originally from El Paso. I'm from a little town called Denison, Texas, which is Eisenhower's birthplace. But you know, on January 15th, 2009, the lives of everyone on Flight 1549 and their families changed instantly, completely, forever. And I think mine more than most, because for most people I've become the public face of this important event. This is one of those events where people remember where they were when they first heard about it. And I think for my family, my wife Lori, who is here. Lori, would you say hi to them? For my wife, Lori, and our two teenage daughters, the intensity of the sudden public focus and becoming globally recognized instantly has been really traumatic and overwhelming. And it's affected each of us in different ways. I know that for my older daughter, Kate, who was then just turning 16 at the time of the flight, the highlight of the last 3.5 years was meeting the president at the inauguration. But for her younger sister, it was meeting one of those boy bands, the Jonas Brothers. But you know, in spite of how much this has changed our lives, and we've become famous, and I've changed careers and become a speaker and an author and a consultant and done important things, we still keep it very real at home. And one early indication of that was at the inauguration, meeting the president and the first lady, and this was just 5 days after the landing. Our heads were still spinning with the sudden changes in our lives. At one point, the president turned to my wife, Lori, and said, "You must be very proud." And she said, "Yes, Mr. President." And then he said, "And you're not letting all this attention go to his head, are you?" To which she immediately replied, "Mr. President, the world may think him a hero, but he still snores." That's a true story. I'm not making this stuff up. It just came out. So then the president said, "Hey, Michelle, you've got to come hear this. She says the same thing about him that you say about me." But we were so fortunate to have such a good day on that day, the day of that flight. And just about the time that we were at the inauguration, or a day after, the National Transportation Safety Board investigators began to listen for the first time to the cockpit voice recorder, the recording of the voices, the sounds in the cockpit during the flight, to begin the investigation, to learn as much as they possibly could about this incredible event. There were 6 people who gathered in the sound laboratory at the NTSB headquarters in Washington, and they put headphones on to begin to listen to the recording. Some of them closed their eyes, the better to be able to concentrate on the tape, to decipher every word and interpret every sound on the recording. And as the tape began, they heard the voices of 2 men, my first officer, Jeff Skiles, and me, working urgently together. 2 men who had very suddenly found themselves in a crucible, fighting not only for the lives of their passengers and crew, but for their own. And in an increasing cacophony of sound, they heard every alarm, alert, warning, continuous repetitive chime, and computerized synthetic voice in the cockpit sounding. Ground proximity warning alerts, enhanced ground proximity warning alerts, traffic collision alerts, and finally that synthetic voice urgently saying, "Terrain, terrain, too low, terrain, too low, gear, too low, flaps, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up," until it suddenly stopped at the end of that recording. The 6 investigators in that room sat there stunned, in silence, overwhelmed by what they had just heard, by the suddenness, the severity of this 208-second-long event. Until finally one of the 6 said, "That guy has been training for this his entire life." He was almost right, but in fact, I think the preparation began even before, because my grandparents were all born in the 19th century, and yet all 4 of them attended college. Remarkable, especially for women of that era. My mother was a first-grade teacher for 25 years in the small Texas town where I grew up. She pursued her passion of education. From her, I received wonderful lifelong gifts, a lifelong love of learning and of reading. My father was a professional, and so I had the great good fortune of growing up in a safe, stable environment in which education was valued, ideas were important, and striving for excellence was expected of me. And so I'm trying to encourage everyone I know to do what I've tried to do in my life, to never stop investing in yourselves, to never stop learning, never stop growing professionally or personally throughout your lives. It served me well. I was fortunate to have enough formal education early in my career to give me a different way of viewing the world, to always appreciate the need for having a deeper understanding of not just the what and the how to do things, but of the why. And the why is always important. It helps us to motivate others, to know why this is important, why it matters, why must we do this. But it also helps us to chart a course in unfamiliar terrain where we don't have all the information, or it's ambiguous or contradictory, where we're facing very suddenly, as we were, a novel and unanticipated circumstance for which we'd never specifically trained. In fact, in our flight simulator training, it's not possible to practice a water landing. The simulators can't replicate it. And believe it or not, the only training we'd ever gotten for a water landing at the airline, and this is still true, was a theoretical classroom discussion. But understanding my profession as well as I did, understanding the why, even in an unfamiliar circumstance, I could set clear priorities and take appropriate actions. And so I think one of the things that is changed in my life is that I now have a deeper appreciation for how much skill, knowledge, and judgment matter. And I also understand how for any of us, our lives can change forever in an instant. And we never know from one moment to the next when that might be. In fact, on January 15, 2009, I had been flying airplanes for 42 years. I'd been an airline pilot for 29. I had 20,000 hours in the air. And during all that time, I had never experienced the failure of even a single engine in flight. We'd certainly had trained for it, but it never happened to me. And that point in my career, late in my career, I thought I probably never would. I was wrong. And like every other flight I'd had for 42 years, Flight 1549 was completely routine and unremarkable for the first 100 seconds. And then it became our ultimate challenge of a lifetime. But you see, for 42 years, I had remained vigilant and avoided complacency and tried to strive for excellence because I never knew when or even if I might one day face some ultimate challenge. Or as I might tell you now, I never knew on which 208 seconds my entire career might be judged. After the flight, I began to hear from colleagues of mine, people I had flown with at the airline decades before, and they started to tell me what they had begun to call Sully stories of long ago events that I had forgotten, but that they hadn't. Because something I had done, something I had said, some situation we had faced and the way I'd handled it had resonated with them. And they remembered them and they were kind enough to share them with me. And sometimes I was told about a long ago important flight-related safety issue that I had successfully taken care of. And sometimes I was simply told about the time that we had arrived at our destination late one night, and after all the other passengers had deplaned, we still had a passenger who needed a wheelchair to be taken up into the terminal. And the person who works at that airport who normally brings the wheelchair down was nowhere to be found. And so I went into the terminal and found a wheelchair, brought it down, and pushed this passenger up the jetway and handed them off to the passenger service agent. My thought process was a very simple one. I've gotten you this far. I'm not going to leave you here now. My colleagues also told me after this flight that they weren't terribly surprised by the outcome on Flight 1549 because of the way they had observed me living my life 4 years before. by leading by example, by building a team, by having integrity, by insisting on the highest professional standards, by always learning. It turns out my reputation had been built one interaction, one person, one day at a time over many years. I think that's how all our lives go. In every encounter with another person, there's inherently an opportunity for good, for ill, or for indifference. We just have to choose which one it's going to be. And so I tell my daughters that at the end of our lives, I think it's unlikely that we'll be counting our money or cataloging the business deals that we made or all the things that we managed to accumulate. I think it's more likely instead that we may simply ask ourselves a question. Did I make a difference? And I suspect for many of you the answer already is yes. So I want to thank you for your time and for your attention, and I think we have time for a few questions right now. If we could raise the house lights a little bit. I think there's some microphones that will be floating around, is that right?
Yes.
There we go. Much better, thank you. Let's see, there's someone right here in the front that you can get to easily. The question is, was my glider flying experience years ago in college and in graduate school helpful for me? And the answer is, I think everything I had done in my life contributed to my ability to solve this problem. But I think what helped me more, because the glider flying was many years ago, and the flight characteristics of the very slow, very lightweight gliders is vastly different than of a large, heavy, fast jet airliner. I think what helped me more was paying attention, trying to manage the height and the speed of the jet airliner precisely on thousands of flights. That enabled me to be able to look out the window and say, no, we can't make it back to the runway at LaGuardia. No, we can't get across to Teterboro. The only place that we can make it to land is the Hudson River. Let's see. There was a lady in white right here.
I just want to know, could you retell exactly what you did?
Oh, you want to hear about the flight itself? Absolutely. We can do that. We got some time. I was the captain of an airliner carrying a total of 155 passengers and crew. And about a minute and a half after takeoff from New York's LaGuardia Airport, we encountered a large flock of Canada geese. And I saw them about 2 seconds before we hit them, but clearly not enough time to turn this big airplane away from them and avoid them. And Canada geese are big birds that weigh 10 or 12 pounds and have 5 or 6 foot wingspans. And the problem was we hit them all across the leading edges of the wings, the nose, and into the center, the core of both jet engines, damaging them, it turns out, irreparably. And we lost thrust. It felt as if the airplane nearly stopped in midair. We began to descend very rapidly. I quickly looked for a place to land, and the only place to land was the Hudson River. And it was in January, so it was bitterly cold. In fact, the air temperature was about 21, the water was about 36. And many people had gotten wet before they were all rescued by the New York waterway ferries that traveled between New York and New Jersey. So it was a close thing, but we had a very good day, and a lot of people, my crew, the first responders, and others all pulled together to solve this emergency and get us all out of the Hudson River. As we came ashore on both sides, New York and New Jersey, the medical technicians were checking us out, looking for indications of hypothermia, having suffered from the cold. And they would ask us, can you feel your fingers? Can you feel your toes? And one young woman passenger responded by saying, oh, I'm used to this. I'm from Fargo, North Dakota.
Question over here.
Yes.
Sir, what was your reaction, your personal reaction, and what are some of the reactions of your passengers as well as your crew?
Well, what was my first reaction as soon as we hit the birds and the engines lost their thrust? It was shocking. The startle factor was huge. I'd been flying as an airline pilot for almost 30 years, and we worked very hard to anticipate and never be surprised by anything. And in all that time, I'd never significantly been challenged where I doubted the outcome. And this, I knew instantly, was going to be an ultimate challenge of a lifetime. And my body responded to that sudden life-threatening stress in a very normal human physiological way. I was aware of that in the seconds as it happened. My blood pressure, my pulse spike, shoot up. I sensed my perceptual field narrow and get tunnel vision because of the stress. It was marginally debilitating. That level of stress interferes with your ability to process and to do the math on altitude and distance and things like that. It required active effort to have the discipline to compartmentalize and focus on flying the airplane and choosing a good flight path in spite of this stress. And my first 3 conscious thoughts, I remember vividly as if it were yesterday. And it's going to take me 3 or 4 minutes now to explain what happened in the first 2 seconds. But I first thought, and this is typical, I understand, from talking to others who have been in similar situations. My first thought was, this can't be happening. Disbelief. Followed immediately by, this doesn't happen to me. In other words, all my flights are more or less routine. And then the third thought was more of a realization that unlike every other flight I'd had for 42 years at that point, that this one probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. And I was okay with that, as long as I could solve the problem. I never worried once about putting a $60 million airliner in the water as long as everyone would survive.
Question back here.
Where is that airplane now?
Thank you. The question is, where is the airplane now? Initially, it was pulled out of the river with a huge crane, put on a barge, taken to New Jersey, put in a salvage yard for several years where the investigators examined every part of it. And now it has been transported to its final location, and I'm happy to say it's at the Carolinas Aviation Museum at the Charlotte Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was the destination of our flight that day. And it's being displayed to the public in its entirety. The Smithsonian wanted only a part of the forward fuselage, the nose of the airplane. Others wanted to sell it for scrap. But the deal was made with the airline, with the insurance company, and with the museum to display it intact, and it's in Charlotte at the Carolinas Aviation Museum. Yes?
Are there any safety precautions that can be taken to prevent birds from flying into the engines?
That's a great question. What can be done to prevent bird strikes from damaging the airplane and posing a safety threat? A lot of people are working on that in a lot of areas. It's a difficult problem. The birds that we hit were migratory birds that can essentially be anywhere. And we struck them about 4 or 5 miles from the airport at almost 3,000 feet above the ground. It's actually, in some ways, easier to try to control birds that roost, that are resident near a certain place. Then there are certain mitigation measures you can use to discourage them. But really what we do know, the one thing we do know for sure about bird strikes around airports is one of the most effective things, one of the only things that we know it works, is to not allow to be built anywhere near a runway. I mean, even within 5 or 10 miles of it, anything that's likely to attract birds, whether it's a garbage facility or a wetland or something else. That's the best thing that we know that works in general. But in terms of strengthening the engines, it's very difficult to do and still make it function normally. There are some experiments with having the landing lights flash to try to make the airplane more conspicuous, and that's only effective if the birds are facing you when they come and you're not overtaking them. There are some radars that have the ability to see objects as small as birds, but they're still in an experimental phase, so it's a difficult issue. But interestingly, to follow on to the Congresswoman's question, the National Transportation Safety Board is an independent federal agency that investigates transportation accidents, such as not only my flight, but the San Bruno pipeline explosion. And they do a great job, a very professional staff. Their chairman, Deborah Hersman, is an outspoken and ardent advocate for safety and not afraid to use her chairmanship as a bully pulpit. But in spite of that, of the 24 some odd recommendations made to improve safety only on the report from our flight, so far none has been adopted by our Federal Aviation Administration, the regulatory agency, or by the airline industry. 0. We're batting 0. And that's happened almost 4 years ago. It's criminal. We need to do a better job of having the safety rules improved much more quickly, and in spite of the cost pressure that the industry puts on the regulators.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, I just have a question. There must have been a few seconds when the the passengers found out or must have known what's happening. Did any of them or a lot of them panicked at this few seconds what's going to happen? I mean, was there a panic in the cabin or with the passengers?
The question is, did the passengers panic? And the reports of what the passenger behavior in the cabin was that initially everyone was very quiet. In fact, as soon as we hit the birds and the engines lost thrust, they said that it was quiet as a library. Not only was there less engine noise, but that it was very quiet. People were not speaking at that point. Once we had gotten closer to the river and it was apparent to more people that we were not, in fact, going to be able to make it back to a runway and we were going to land in the water, then people were obviously more concerned. There was some crying, there was some talking going on. People were trying to text or call their loved ones in messages. One passenger, or at least maybe two passengers, sitting near windows were trying to estimate the time remaining until we touched the water, and they were doing a countdown for people around them to understand what was going on. And then once we had landed, and from what we all felt and observed, it was obvious that the airplane remained intact and was stable and was floating. And we began to evacuate onto the rafts and the wings. Then it was reported that the passengers felt a sense of elation, that they had survived what they thought might not have been survivable. And the rescue began to happen very quickly. The first New York Waterway ferry arrived within 4 minutes of our landing. And then by the time I left the airplane as the last one through the cabin to make sure everybody was off, the ferries were all around us and the rescue was well underway. So I understand that my time is up, but it's been wonderful to spend a little bit of time with you. Thank you for your time and your attention.
I'll just see Mr. Stand up now. So, Sully, I have a question, two questions. Had you been able to get the plane back to the airport, would the landing have been better at the airport, or was it better in the water?
Well, obviously, my first choice was to land on a runway. I knew from experience that there were only 2 runways even anywhere close to us, anywhere near us at all. The LaGuardia Airport, from which we had departed, but at that point we were still heading away from, and with no engine thrust, we were descending rapidly. In fact, we were descending so rapidly, if you were in an elevator, it would be 2 floors per second. And the only other runway near us was at the Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. When I had examined the distance, it was clearly too far, and that left only the river. But there were, just to clarify, even if we'd had enough altitude to be able to make it back to a runway, that itself would not have solved all the problem. We still would have had to be able to lower the landing gear, get the flaps all the way out to make for a slower landing. I would have had to very accurately judge, as we were coming down rapidly with no engine thrust on this steep approach, visually when to begin raising the nose for landing so that we didn't hit too hard and break the airplane and cause a post-crash fire. I would have to keep the flight path aligned exactly with the center of the runway and not go off the side. I'd have to be able to stop before we went off the end. So there were a lot of other things we still would have had to do even if we'd made it back to a runway, but if I could have, I would have. Because placing 155 people in a cold river requiring essentially immediate rescue to survive solved the first problem, but it created others.
You said that the ferries were there within 4 minutes?
Yes. So the fact that I knew from experience, having visited Manhattan, and specifically the Intrepid, the former aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid, which is now a museum ship on the southwest side of Manhattan, I knew that the ferry traffic was heavy right there between Pier 79 on Manhattan and the Weehawken, New Jersey terminal. And so I turned left to go south in the Hudson, trying to make it that far, to a place where I knew we'd be rescued quickly. If we had landed even a mile north or south of where we did, the rescue would have taken much longer. So from their Weehawken, New Jersey terminal, the New York Waterway staff saw us land on their own initiative without waiting for any official notification. They radioed their vessels to immediately turn toward us. The first one, the Thomas Jefferson, arrived 3 minutes, 55 seconds after we stopped. And there were 6 or 8 vessels around us as I stepped off the airplane. And so the evacuation took about 3.5 minutes. I think the rescue took another 20 or so. And then everyone was off.
Unbelievable. Isn't that an incredible story? So, Sully, we have a gift for you.
Thank you.
But for all of you, we have 10 copies? 8 copies of the book he just published, Making a Difference, which is the second book. His first book, Highest Duty, is the story
Yes.
of the experience. And this book is, why don't you tell us a little bit about what
Absolutely.
this book's about?
So the first book, Highest Duty, was a memoir and a story of the flight, of my life being a preparation for that flight. The second book, which came out in May, is a leadership book, and it's based upon Lori and my family traveling the world, meeting world leaders, people we wouldn't have met, experiences we wouldn't have had in 100 of our normal lifetimes before the flight, and people, all of whom I admired because they exhibited moral courage. And some of them are people that you would know. For example, Tony La Russa, the recently retired manager of the St. Louis Baseball Cardinals, who won the World Series a year ago.
Not this year.
Not this year. Well, he's retired now, but he took him to the series last year. And he's a friend of mine because he lives near us in the off-season. Robert Reich, who's at Berkeley, a former Clinton-era labor secretary, very, very brilliant man. By far the most intellectual of the conversations I had in doing the interviews that the book is based upon. Thad Allen, the recently retired Coast Guard commandant who was brought in to fix the federal response to Hurricane Katrina, and then later the BP oil spill and the earthquake in Haiti. And many others. So it's finding common themes about what works and what doesn't in leadership, and the fact that even in these difficult, very divisive times politically, that we do have people who have the right values and are making a difference every day out there. We don't have them all in our public life yet.